Welcome to Insights for IT Negotiations, a podcast by UpperEdge, a leading IT sourcing, negotiation, and project execution advisory firm. I'm John Belden, UpperEdge's Chief Research and Strategy Officer.
And I'm Kylie Chisholm, UpperEdge's Marketing Manager. Join us every other week as we share insights to help you maximize the value of your key IT relationships. In each episode, we'll delve into the topics that matter most to IT decision makers and sourcing professionals.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Insights for IT Negotiations. I'm Kylie Chisholm. I am UpperEdge's Content Marketing Manager. I am joined by my co-host, John. John, how are you doing today?
I am doing fantastic. I am super stoked today.
Super stoked. Yeah, I'm stoked as well. We have a really great guest today. We are joined today by Marc Kermisch, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Emergent Software. He has a really great background in all things SIs, digital transformations, and that's exactly what we're going to pick his brain on today, is specifically the impact of generative AI on digital transformations, both on the SI side and on the customer side. So without further ado, John, I'll pass the baton over to you to kick the conversation off and introduce our guest.
All right, fabulous. Yeah, Mark, I really appreciate you joining us today. I think you and I have probably known each other 12 years or so back when you were with Excel Energy. But I think it would be great for our audience if you just kind of introduced yourself from the standpoint of your background, where your career has taken you, and how you ended up where you're at today.
Sure. Well, it's great to see you too, John. I think you're right. It has been 12 plus years. I'm an IT guy through and through. I started my career, as a developer back in the first era of the dot-com age, and really kind of grew up through corporate America. Spent time at Target Corporation, Excel Energy, Red Wing Shoes, United Healthcare, and most recently at C&H, which manufactured tractors and construction equipment. And recently shifted over to the consulting side of the world and joined Emergent Software, which is a full stack Microsoft partner, customizing in data, cloud, and custom development.
Yeah. So what can you tell us a little bit more about Emergent Software or that firm? What exactly do they do? Who are the customers that they serve today?
Yeah, so Emergent Software is primarily a US-based technology company that focuses on helping Microsoft customers take advantage of the Microsoft platform. Everything from building their modern data platforms inside of Microsoft's Fabric, migrating traditional compute to cloud compute, or developing custom applications that serve specific needs. We focus primarily on the mid-market space. So anything from 50 million up to about $1.5 billion is kind of our sweet spot, with a handful of outliers on either side.
I think it's really interesting that you've gone from kind of that big industry, kind of working in that space, down to a smaller space. Before we get into the subject, any advice that you have for aspiring CIOs in industry as to what they ought to be, watching out for, or what they ought to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think in today's world of technology, the modern CIO has to be as much a student of technology as they are the business that they're operating in, right? And they have to be more open than ever on, different operating models of where does technology talent sit within the organization. It may not always be within the function of the CIO. And they've got to be, really hyper-focused on educating their organization on these latest and greatest technologies, right? Be it generative AI, machine learning, computer vision, how is robotics going to impact an organization, and so on and so forth. And it runs a gamut from regulatory compliance impacts, security impacts, to business capability enablement, and strategic growth. So it's a tough job. It's a fun job, because you get to see every aspect of your business, right? You're not just a function, you support 100% of the company. Which is sometimes, I think, forgotten by some CIOs, right? They're not just a functional leader. They're not a back office service. They are front and center in today's world, in driving business.
And I used to give the advice to the people when I was working in industry that, there comes a point within your career, and some people can do both, right? But you have to make a choice of, am I going to make myself valuable to my company, or am I going to make myself valuable to the industry? in terms of being able to think about the technology and the application of the technology. And that's a tough choice to make sometimes, right? That says, I really need to get into my organization and find out where that value is going to be. But that means I can't be the end all be all on the technology expert.
Right. I think it's a great perspective, and certainly a hard choice. And for me, I probably anchored more to being the agnostic industry technology expert. Even just based off the number of industries I've bumped in and out of over
Exactly.
my career. And there's no wrong answer, right?
No.
It's probably led me to what I'm doing today, which is servicing companies across every industry, tied to what I believe is one of the best technology partners out there right now.
Yeah. So ultimately, you made that choice of valuable to the valuable to the industry, right,
Mhm.
versus valuable to one particular company, and kind of being married to that company now for the rest of your career,
Yes. Yes.
right? So, well, I want to get into the subject of generative AI, and in particular, generative AI as an enabler for transformation, right? So, not thinking about necessarily embedding generative AI into your processes, but thinking about the use of generative AI as an accelerator for business transformation. And if you read the industry rags, right? I mean, there's some of them that are out there that will say this spells the doom for systems integrators, right? And that they're in this, it's a race to zero. And then there's other parts of it that says this is what's going to propel the growth of systems integrators for the next 10 years as companies go in and actually have to put in generative AI, right? So there's kind of both sides of the equation there. If you get in and look at Accenture's numbers, right, and I spend a little bit of time looking at Accenture because they're a publicly traded company, what you'll see is they are definitely growing in the space of generative AI. But what you're also seeing is the other areas and the other services that they are providing are shrinking in terms of the actual services. And I can't help think, right, that some of that shrinking is the actual application of generative AI at companies saying we don't need those services from Accenture at this level anymore because maybe we've actually implemented. So it's just kind of a theory I've got out there right now that says, is that happening? So I'd love to know, kind of from your perspective, right? How are you seeing today the application of generative AI and how it might be affecting the market in terms of the application of systems integration services?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got a really astute observation there, and you've probably heard this saying before: is like your job's not going to get replaced by generative AI, but you could be replaced by somebody who's using generative AI to do your job better, right? And I think you
Absolutely.
see a lot of that today, and I think there's like a handful of areas that are putting pressure on system integrators. If I'm a subscriber to the deep learning module of ChatGPT, I effectively have a McKinsey, BCG, or Accenture in my pocket that I can get really thoughtful answers from at a lot less money than potentially engaging that SI for an initiative. Uh, if I'm a engineer at a corporation, right, I'm seeing productivity gains by using, GitHub's Copilot or Claude's code generator, or I may not need to turn to a low cost provider or system integrator like I used to because I can expand capacity before I hit a breaking point. Same thing with requirements writing, contract, evaluations and negotiations. I was working with a client where very nice lady in procurement, and she's like, I use ChatGPT to sharpen my tone in my emails when I'm in a negotiation, right? She's like, I know I just can't do it personally, so they do it for me, right? So I think when you think about how people are applying it, I think system integrators are essentially now having to negotiate back with much smarter clients than they ever have before.
Um, and that's kind of an interesting point on the negotiations, right? Because this is an area that I've done a lot of thinking about as well. Um, Specifically in the area of negotiations with a systems integrator, right? Um, One of the things that you would expect is that from a maturity standpoint, the systems integrators would be at this level, right, in terms of using generative AI on their sales and marketing and negotiation processes, where the clients are using chat gpt perhaps just in a conversational mode, right, and they're only right here, right, they're not at the same level as the systems integrators. So while they're both using generative ai, right, one is probably using it at a much higher level than the other and understands exactly the capabilities, right, that the client has in terms of the negotiations. And does that actually create an unleveling of the playing field, if you will, because the systems integrators are bringing much more firepower to the negotiations now.
You know, I don't think you're wrong in that respect, right? I think, 18, maybe 24 months ago, I probably would have said they were a little bit more on the level, right? Because the technology was so new. But I think back to looking at the service breakdown of these, of an Accenture, for example, where they're now putting more resources towards generative AI projects. I think we have to assume they're also learning within their own business on how to apply it, on how to better serve their customers, how to better serve and negotiate with their customers as well. And ultimately, like if I'm the CEO of Accenture, right, my biggest expense is my people. And so if I can find a way to reduce my overhead by applying generative AI, one of the best places to apply that is my legal department, right? uh, and my negotiation teams. Because ultimately, if they can load every single contract they've ever done and put that into generative AI to produce and respond to an RFI, right? They're going to be able to do that better, right? And they may be able to say, hey, I may not increase the number of wins I get. Like, so I may not go from 20% of RFIs won to 30, but I might be able to say I can flow another 100 RFI responses in every year. So I'm actually just increasing my win volume at the same rate.
it, the other thing that I think it's going to do is it's going to challenge clients to understand the differences between SIs, because now let's go down this path that you just did, right? Let's go down to the path Accenture, Deloitte, EY, PwC, all very good at the application of generative AI, all using it to respond to RFIs and RFPs right now, right? You're going to get a lot of RFIs and a lot of RFP responses that look really close to being the same because they're going to be very comprehensive. They're going to be founded on this generative AI. And now it's going to be a question of, as an organization, how do I evaluate the differences now between these responses? Just one side story before you give your response. We were working with an airline company, right? And the airline company had gone out to the let's call it the five biggest vendors, and we were looking at the RFP responses. Three of the RFP responses almost looked identical to with respect to, they all tried to put their response in the vernacular of the airline industry and describe their solution using the terminology of an airline industry, right? So, you're on the runway, or you're taking your plane for maintenance, right? So you could tell that most likely scenario is they went into their own chat GPT and said, take our RFP response and put it in the terminology of the customer. But it was like I was reading the same response from three different customers, right? So how do you differentiate these SIs now?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, right? And just like professors at universities are starting to detect when AI is used and not by their students, I think clients have to get smart and in some respects challenge back their responses and saying, "Hey, this looks like you use generative AI to write this and respond." Unfortunately, we don't get a good sense of who you are because you've genericized your response. And now we're going to ask something else of you, right? Either I want to have face-to-face meetings and a dialogue, right, where you can't have generative AI in between you, or it might be, yeah, I want to see every single resume that's going to be on my account. I just don't want to see the top five or the principals. I want every single resume loaded in so I can use my own GPT to evaluate their skill sets and efficacy against this project we're going to deliver together. Um, and it also might mean that you're focused more on the pricing component than the fluffy language around the pricing component.
Yeah, which means it could backfire.
It could backfire because I think at the same time, I've seen some procurement departments just like you, like they're trying to load in responses into Chat GPT or Copilot, and they're trying to do faster analysis and price parity when they're looking at the bids. And ideally, it's like, hey, can I get smarter answers around margin? And ultimately, I do think you'll see some companies starting to force stated margin responses in the RFP.
Good. Talk more about that.
And so this is specific, like if I'm hiring a bunch of configuration or engineering talent from Accenture, for example, when I was at CNH, I said, well, how do I know you're not padding your margin by using ChatGPT to drive productivity? And are you billing me for that productivity gain or not? Right. And we had long dialogues this was about a year ago, and they hadn't figured out how to price that back to the customer.
Right.
Because my comment is I expect 30% reduction in my rate because you guys are using ChatGPT for coding.
Right.
And of course, they're like, well, we can't do that. And I said, well, if you're telling me, because they would say we're seeing 20% gains in their productivity using these tools, I said, great. I should see a 20% reduction in my bill. So how about you walk me through your margin by role and which roles are using ChatGPT, and you should be able to hold margin by passing that savings on to me.
And I'm sure you got the response, we're selling value, not margin, right?
Yeah, but I think it's going to put, to your point, I think it's going to put pressure on their ability to continue to justify the value versus margin. And sadly, to your point of like a race to the bottom, I do think it'll be a bit more of, a leveling of the playing field as it relates to how a manufacturer procures bolts, because it truly is on a margin. Hey, I'm only going to give you 4% margin on this bolt, and I'll commit this volume to you, right? For that extra point off, for example.
Yeah, that was that goes back to, now I'm going to show how how my aging is here. Back in the 80s, when I was working in the manufacturing industry, and we had to deal with companies like Chrysler, Ford, and GM, and every year they knew that we were taking our manufacturing offshore, right? And because they knew we were taking our manufacturing offshore, we had to commit to price reductions, right, over the period of the contract. And it's almost the same as your AMS agreements right now, where you expect productivity. I think we're see the same thing in the transformation space, right? Which says you're going to have to commit to productivity over the life of the contract versus coming at me with incremental price increases because of the cost of living.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think you're 100% right. Is that you're going to see negotiations converge between transformation and managed service like contracts, and an expectation that you can, like, your cost of living adjustments should be being solved by productivity gains through tools and technology like ChatGPT. So if inflation's 6% and I expect you have a 20% productivity gain, then you should be passing on, that 14% back to me, right? Versus the full 20. So you're taking it out of your side, not my side.
Yeah, at least give me my share of that, right? At least because I'm funding your reductions.
Yeah, and you think about the function of QA inside of a large transformation project, right? And the role that a client could use a generative AI to actually QA the QA, and say, okay, I'm going to load all my requirements in, and I'm going to determine like what's my test case coverage, for example.
Yeah, and that was that's one of the interesting parts, Mark, that I've been thinking about a lot over the last 2 weeks, is thinking about how transformation methodologies are going to change, right, over the next 5 years. And one of the things that occurred to me was, let's go back to your old company as an example, and let's use CNH, which for those that are not familiar, I think CNH was about a $40 billion organization, or at least I don't remember what your sales were, but I know you're a large multinational.
Yeah, $24 billion, 46 plants around the world, right?
Big deal,
yeah.
right? Big deal, high sophistication, right? And I started to think about, well, companies like CNH would be constructing a generative AI strategy to capture, let's call it, the knowledge base of CNH, and they would be creating their own agents, right, that kind of represent the knowledge base associated with whether it be customer service, manufacturing, supply chain, or whatever. And now you're going to have systems integrators coming in with their own models and transformations in their own knowledge base. What does the integration challenge of the future look like when now we have to say, well, Accenture or Deloitte, you've got your generative AI models and your methodologies, but we need you to marry that with our generative AI in order to be able to figure out how we're going to pull that information out of our system, put it into your system to meld methodologies and industry knowledge with our specific knowledge, right? And I'm sitting there going, all right, my head's going to break as I start as I start to think about this, right? I mean, have you given any thought to that kind of particular problem and how that's going to materialize?
I would say this. I think you're on the forefront of thinking through that, right? And as I hear you talk, like there's a couple of things that kind of go through my mind. I as CNH with generative AI probably could do a much better job understanding differences between plants if I'm doing like a big SAP MRP rollout, right? So I could load standard operating procedures from each plant in and do an immediate analysis of where are the gaps between process, where do I need to lean in for commonization, where are these plants unique where I should have some differentiation, and then how does that compare to what my SI might tell me or not? Or maybe it's I'm informing them now instead of buying that analysis from them in the future. I think the other piece is, the agentic approach to generative AI, where I can create my own agents with a combination of robotic process automation embedded, starts to break the need for integrations.
I agree with you.
Right? And so now it's like, hey, maybe I've deployed all these agents and I'm now going to do an upgrade. So maybe some of the agents get rationalized out, but maybe some can, stay. But even when you think about change management, role-based security, training, user-based counts, like that might be different now because I've got an agent that's doing the work on behalf of the worker instead of the traditional person doing it. How does that work back with the SI?
Yeah, so
Yes.
you start to think about in the traditional world, you always had deliverables, right, and a RACI. Does that evolve now into the RACI that says, well, the RACI's become something different now, right? There's the um, I'm going to refer to it as the agentic RACI, right? My agents are going to do this, your agents are going to do this. There's still going to need to be somebody that is accountable and responsible, right? But I need your agent to participate in this, right? So I need to be able to get its opinion into the mix in a fashion. And then maybe that becomes kind of the transformation model of the future, if you will, is we've got to think about what the integration strategy, but maybe it's not integration, right? Maybe it's participation strategy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Into delivering a solution.
Yeah, and you think of, I don't know if SAP still utilizes the RICEF term, right? But it changes the RICEFs.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think it also, especially when you think about, I always said there's three things to mind yourself on a big transformational project. One is your legacy integrations, your data conversion, and your reporting, right? I think reporting actually becomes easier, especially with like the onset of these, lake house databases, be it by the software provider like SAP or maybe someone more agnostic like Microsoft, where I don't have to have the real data conversion like I used to. I might be able to dump it into that lake and still be able to build the reporting that I need without going through that real detailed conversion.
Yeah, that whole space of the services that the systems integrators provide, right? I mean, to me, that's just going to come under tremendous fire in the next 2 to 3 years, as you mentioned, right? I mean, we've talked about the development of testing scripts. Well, I mean, that should be pretty straightforward, right? The development of code should be pretty straightforward. I start to think about some of these things now. I think the biggest impact is going to be on offshore resources right out of the gate, because those are the ones that I think that are most likely to be consumed. But configuration, right? You can almost envision SAP saying, you don't need a configurator anymore. I'm going to put that agent out there that's going to be the, the configurator for IBP for you. You just put your requirements in, and no longer do we think about, oh, we've got a standard industry template that everybody has to use. But the differentiator becomes, oh, you can make it do exactly what you want, and you don't have to be the same as everybody else anymore to get the efficiencies.
Did you know that UpperEdge offers subscription advisory services? This on-demand solution provides essential benchmarks and market insights specific to your business needs precisely when you need it, empowering you and your team to make informed decisions for your IT initiatives. Position your team for success. Reach out today via the link in the show notes to learn more.
Yeah, well, and now it's like, I don't know if you guys use it in UpperEdge, but I certainly do, which is the transcription function of Teams or some third-party AIs that do that, right? So I can be having a workshop with a customer and I can transcribe that whole workshop and I can go back into my own generative AI and say, please write the requirements captured in this workshop and write corresponding test cases with it, right? Identify gaps and give me follow-up questions to ask. And all of that happens in seconds now. And so, when you go back to even the timeline durations, right? And you say, hey, I should be able to get through a, kind of current state to to be process discussion with the requirements flushed out now in half the time, or maybe even in, 10% of the time than I used to, because I've got these tools now at my fingertips. And what would be interesting is, yeah, maybe I need the SI to facilitate the dialogue, but maybe I, as the client, now going to take ownership for my requirements because I have the tool to do it in house. And then maybe the SI flips into more of a QA role than they are actually the doer of the requirements themselves.
Yeah, so we've been channeling down really quickly here this doom for the SI, right? The But let's take the flip side now, right? Let's take the side that says, what are the risks of AI, especially when I'm going down the do it yourself mode, right? That says, hey, I can apply these things, and man, I can go very fast. And what are the risks that people need to think about now in the application of this in doing transformations?
Yeah, I think, there's a handful of risks that come to mind. First, AI is only as good as the data set it's trained on, right? So as a client, right, as C&H, like I have a limited set of data when it comes to if I'm implementing SAP versus the SI, which may have 50,000 implementations they can build an AI model on. Second is I'm going to be under cost pressures, right? And unfortunately, the current cost structure of AI hits a CIO's OpEx immediately because it's all cloud-based services, right? And so because of that, like I've got that cost component that layers on top, and in some cases it can be very expensive very quickly. The third is I lack skill sets. So as the client, do I have the skill sets to actually do this on my own? Right. I think to your comment earlier, where the client's using ChatGPT to get basic questions answered, where the SI's got full modeling that they've customized for their business, I think you're still going to see that gap because of the cost and the skill sets needed for me as the client to come up to parity. Right. So I do think there's aspects of risk there that would say that there's still a pretty long shelf life for SIs to be very successful in this space before we could ever be fully self
Yeah,
reliant.
I remember telling our team at UpperEdge about generative AI and saying it can make you look really smart and it can make you look really dumb, right? If you're not if you don't have some level of domain expertise when working with the tool and just blind trust in the answers that it's giving you, you're going to end up in a lot of trouble right down the road, right? You still need to have some level of domain expertise in order to be able, as you kind of put it, to QA the answers, to be able to even say, right, does it make sense in my situation? Because one of the things I think that the AI is limited on today is understanding the actual context, right, and grasping the context of the particular situation. I'm sure you've run into the problems with the AI before where you're having a really long conversation and you're an hour and a half into it, and all of a sudden it has completely forgot what you told it an hour and a half ago, right?
Yeah. I mean, a great example, right, is I was doing a bunch of research around is offshoring successful or not for the majority of companies? Right. And what examples where, Best Buy notoriously outsourced everything to Accenture back in the early aughts. And then, 15 years later, they insourced the majority of it. Right. You've seen that with IBM in the day and so on and so forth. And what are the drivers behind that? And it was really interesting because the public data set around those that bring it back in house is really limited. So the conversation with the agent really struggled to get me the data that I need. I could get anecdotes, but couldn't get down to hard data. And so I couldn't use it to say replace traditional research methodology and client interviews and so on and so forth. And it goes back in some cases, this new function that's coming up, which you're going to have prompt engineer writers, right?
Right.
And so for me, when I'm working with a client and I'm using AI to help supplement my day, I'm asking questions that I probably know the answer to, but I want additional data. Right. What's the ratio of
Right.
IT spend revenue? Like I know what it is anecdotally, but give me some examples. And the different AIs are even fun to test because ChatGPT will give me an answer, Perplex will give me another one, Claude will give me another one, and Copilot will give me another one. And so now I've got to have multiple AIs to kind of balance out which one's right.
Yeah.
Or to the right answer, right? Before I feel confident sharing it back with a client or running with it.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of where we were getting to before, when companies become mature enough and they have their own AIs, and now there's conflicting answers. What's the resolution process, right? And I, the more we have this conversation right now, it's becoming clear to me that part of the differentiation I think that systems integrators are going to have to be able to put out there is this is how we are sustaining and maintaining the context of the problem that we are trying to solve with the tools that we're using, right? Whether it's the context of the business case, the context of the risk profile, the context of other decisions that have already been made on a project. How does your AI solution, right, ensure that context integrity exists? I think that's going to be a big, that to me, that's kind of a really big nut to crack for the SI.
It is. And I think there's a couple of things SIs can think about, right? I think they have to figure out how to productize AI that's a part of the delivery mechanism of the transformation, right? So they may say, hey, we've built a requirements AI for SAP, for Oracle, right? For Workday, success factors, whatever. And we're going to bring that AI during the requirements phase, right? Change management, right? We're going to do all these employee surveys to manage change. And we're going to enable an AI to allow the client to have immediate visibility into where hotspots are within the company by being able to ask questions of that.
Right.
So I think that's one way that they can do it. And frankly, all of those products become margin generators for them because they should be able to do it with less people. If they're training this thing and they can reuse all that knowledge from one client to the next. And what's interesting is I, as a client, should also have the right to say, you're not allowed to take my data and put it in your model.
Right.
Now they may say, hey, that's okay, but now you can't use our model. Right. So there's some interesting, ramifications of some of that. I also think they could create some other interesting products. You go back to reporting, they could say, look, we can create your new data lake warehouse for your new ERP implementation. And we're going to have it such that we can embed it with a generative AI that now you can truly have the natural language querying of data. Show me year over year sales between 22 and 26, right? Which products are having the best margin, performance this year? Which ones are under pressure? Like all those things that we've all been hoping for decades. Like they could create that as a product that sells alongside of SAP's AI layer or Oracle's or Microsoft's or whoever. And I haven't seen the SIs do that well, right? But I think that's a huge opportunity for them if they can, kind of get to that product-based view
Yeah,
of the world.
you're right. I agree with you. I haven't seen them do it well, but part of the strategy that is visible to us, like i.e., like Accenture, if you look at who they're buying, right? What is their acquisition strategy, right? Is their acquisition strategy one of, we're going to go out and buy these products and then develop them, and enhance them, or is their strategy one of of we're just buying this company because of the knowledge that they have, right?
Yeah.
And we're bringing that knowledge in because we need the knowledge. I think we see a bit of mix of both at Accenture, but I think that's part of the way they let's call it crack that nut of, well, we don't need to develop the product. We're just going to go buy somebody who has this product already, and we're going to figure out how to market it.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, right? I think what'll be really interesting to watch is the employment levels of the SIs, right? 'Cause I think Accenture's like at 300,000
Oh, at
employees or so.
least, yeah, at least.
And do we start to see their employee count go down, but revenues actually stay flat or go up because they're using AI to drive better productivity?
Yeah.
Uh,
I think the Chinese, at least for me, are going to get their wish for me for the next 5 years, and that is live in interesting times. I can't think of a more interesting time to actually live in, right, than where we're at right now in terms of watching everything shift. Mark, to kind of wrap it up, if you look at, I can't even say a 5 year horizon anymore, because anybody who pretends to predict what it's going to look like in 5 years, right, is probably nuts. But if you look at 2 years out, right, and you were to say, well, what do you think is going to be happening in 2 years, right? And what should CIOs really be focused on in this space of generative AI? What would your advice be in that space? Because we've covered a lot of ground today.
yeah. So if I think about it from the lens of a CIO, I look at it maybe three ways. Over the next 2 years, I mean, we're living in the worst AI will ever experience today, right? Because it's only get better tomorrow. And I think you're going to experience it in three ways as a CIO. One, your software partners are going to advance their AI capabilities faster than you could ever do internally, and you should absolutely be taking advantage of those where you can, right? Get your Copilot license from Microsoft, buy SAP's AI, use Agentforce from Salesforce, right? Within that particular system, you're going to get benefits and you're going to see productivity gains, and you should set some really strong KPIs. I need to save 100,000 hours of time. I need to drive growth by 2 or 3%. I want to improve my external NPS scores by 10. So you can then say, okay, with my use cases, I can line up and measure. Second is, you're starting to see low code versions of AI become available. Copilot Studio is a great example. I, as a citizen developer, I can enable finance to load in their own documentation and start to build agents and even do some next best action based off of those interactions and drive some automation. HR is an easy one. Load up all of your HR information that an employee needs to know, launch an HR agent and allow them at it. What's my PTO, right? How do I submit for benefits claim? How do I submit for a leave of absence? What's our dress code? What's our return to office policy, right? All that stuff can be done through an agent. The last piece is you have to start identifying where you have proprietary content that you can create your own LLM experience for your business. One that could either drive customer engagement or drive sales, right? So at CNH, one of the biggest challenges we have in the dealer network is it was difficult to hire and retain service technicians to repair vehicles. And when we got a new service technician in, that dealer would have that person shadow and white-haired service guy, and that white-haired guy got less productive because he was constantly having to answer questions from the junior guys. So we took all of our service manuals and we loaded them all into an LLM and trained that LLM such that now in the pocket of their pants and their phone, they can say, hey, I'm working on an 875 tractor. What is the timing belt configuration and what part number is that timing belt and how do I replace it? Right. And then it pops up the PDF instructions. It can sync back to that PDF page for the visuals. And now they don't have to go ask the senior technician. And so those types of examples as a CIO where you can lean in and look at those three paths over the next 2 years, you've got to show progress. Because if you don't, your business is going to turn to somebody else to do it for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate that, Mark. And I think we share kind of a like mindset in that way, right? There's so much low hanging fruit right now that you shouldn't necessarily have to go out and try to recreate the killer application. Just take advantage of what is in front of you that's reasonably low cost right now that you can apply.
Yeah, 100%.
So, well, Mark, I really, really appreciate you taking the time today on this. I know, I think we want to make sure that we get your contact information in the notes of this. I think our clients are going to find it extremely useful in terms of your thoughts on this subject, and hopefully we'll be able to talk again in the future.
Yeah, I think we should plan a year from now to step in and do a check-in. It's okay. Did what actually happened, and are we further along this path or not? And I look forward to hearing you guys talk about how the SI world is changing and the world of negotiations are changing in this generative AI world we live in now.
Okay, Kylie, want to wrap us up?
Yeah. It's funny. As a fly on the wall to this conversation, I was thinking we're going to have to reach back out to you in a year from now because I want to know the updates. So you hit the nail on the head there. Where would be the best place for people to reach out for you if they want to continue the conversation with you?
Yeah, there's a couple. Our website's a great way to get a hold of us. It's emergentsoftware.net is where you can find us online. You can hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active. It's Marc, M-A-R-C, Kermish, Kermisch. Link in with me and send me a note. Would love to hear from your listeners on things that are of interest to them or their opinions on this topic.
Awesome. Perfect. And I'll make sure to have both of those in the show notes below so people can navigate to it easily. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, Marc. This was a super insightful conversation, and we'll definitely be talking to you in the future.
Sounds great. Thank you both.
Thank you for listening to Insights for IT Negotiations. This episode was hosted by John Belden and Kylie Chisholm and produced by Mike Brown. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss a new episode. For more information on IT sourcing and risk management strategies, visit UpperEdge.com and subscribe to our monthly UpperEdge newsletter. Thank you for listening.